In 1890, New Orleans, USA, Ernest Greenfield was seen every morning unloading crates of smoked meats at his Chartres Street stall, where a thin, reddish grease leaked steadily through the floorboards and into the gutter, attracting dogs. Locals praised the quality of his pork shoulders and salt-cured ribs, noting their tenderness and uniform color, yet none could identify the source of his livestock. Greenfield, lean and clean-shaven, wore a spotless apron and spoke in precise clerical tones, often quoting market ordinances by heart and refusing to haggle. He ran his stall within the French Market, a sprawling institution near the riverfront, where dozens of vendors operated under loose supervision and minimal inspection. In the years after Reconstruction, amid mass migration, wage collapse, and a yellow fever panic, city officials focused on trade growth, not regulation. But a 9-page 1889 Sanitary Board report cited unidentifiable animal matter, logged weekly in Greenfield's refuse barrels. Who controlled what was sold, and who dared to ask? Ernest Greenfield was widely respected as a disciplined vendor with impeccable bookkeeping and an unmatched command of local food law, his voice always calm and his apron always crisp. Yet a 1890 police inventory of the French Market's discarded crates listed 5 human molars, wrapped in butcher's paper and dated to the prior week, prompting a quiet investigation into stall 47. Microlead completed. By mid-January of 1890, the rains had turned the unpaved alleys behind the French Market into a slick grey mire. Stall 47, managed by Ernest Greenfield, stood slightly elevated on timber blocks, yet the wooden supports were always wet to the touch, streaked with rust-colored stains that never dried. Vendors along the northern row began complaining about a persistent metallic odor, sharp like pennies rubbed between fingers, that lingered into the late afternoons. The source seemed elusive, but most agreed it intensified near Greenfield's barrels. One of the first to file a report, albeit unofficially, was Odette Broussard, a laundress whose basin stood opposite the fishmonger's corridor. In her journal, discovered decades later in an estate sale, she described how, on the 6th of February, a cart of offal from the meat vendor spilled beside my washing bench. The stench was unbearable, not of rot but of something too clean, as if boiled skin were scraped raw again. She noted Greenfield stood silently as 2 dock workers shoveled the contents back into his barrels, neither looking up nor speaking. At the time, the Sanitary Board of New Orleans had limited reach. Funding shortages meant inspections were rarely unannounced, and most officers prioritized cholera prevention over market compliance. Greenfield maintained pristine records. His ledger, submitted monthly to the district office, listed consistent purchases from regional farms that, upon later inquiry, proved either defunct or untraceable. Yet none of this raised concern in 1890. His account was considered exemplary. Things began to shift in March, when a boy named Lucien Dupree, aged 11, was sent by his uncle, a known meat supplier, to deliver hog carcasses. The Duprees had serviced the market for years, bringing livestock from their farm near the Pearl River. Lucien's statement, taken months later by City Detective Myron Hale, recalled a peculiar silence inside the rear storage of stall 47. "He told me not to open the canvas flap," Lucien wrote. "But I heard water dripping and a chain being wound up and something dragging across the floor." Greenfield had no assistants, no apprentices. He worked alone, yet never seemed strained. Witnesses noted his remarkable energy and precision, especially for a man nearing 40. He was always the first to arrive, usually before dawn, and the last to close. At night, his shutters clanked shut with exacting rhythm. Even in summer heat, he wore gloves when handling meats and never smoked or drank with the other vendors. A record from April 3, 1890, filed in the Office of Public Sanitation, documented a non-conforming odor complaint near stall 47. The complaint, written in neat cursive on yellowing stationery, cited repeated incidents of chemical or anatomical scent inconsistent with pork processing. The inspector assigned to the case, a Mr. Silas Boone, made a single visit and recorded no violations. His field notes, however, mention an excess of brine vats and unusually pale sausage casing. He did not return. The first known physical clue appeared in May. During a storm that knocked loose several vendor awnings, A worker named Martin Feeney, contracted to repair broken eaves, slipped behind stall 47 to stabilize the eastern gutter. What he found was not immediately understood. Beneath a loose board, partially buried in wet straw, lay a bundle wrapped in burlap, heavily soaked. Feeney assumed it was food waste until the cloth shifted and a knuckle, small and discolored, rolled out. The object, later identified as part of a human hand, was never reported. Feeney was an Irish immigrant with 2 warrants on his name. He fled the city days later. The hand vanished and the incident remained unspoken, but it marked a threshold. In June, the humidity became unbearable. The air clung to skin and flies overtook the southern corner of the market. At least 5 merchants filed sanitation requests that month, citing foul drainage and suspected runoff from nearby stalls. Most complaints named Greenfield's lot. Yet when city workers came to flush the storm grates, they found the drains blocked with congealed fat. A long iron hook was used to dislodge the mass, revealing hair, fine dark strands embedded in the grease. This time there was some alarm. Detective Hale, then recently transferred from the 3rd Precinct, was ordered to review the matter. Hale, a methodical man with little taste for conjecture, spent 3 days walking the market grounds in plain clothes. His report, dated July 12th, described Greenfield as courteous, precise and deferential, noting that the vendor voluntarily opened his cold storage, which appeared clean, odorless and orderly. But Hale added a line that did not sit well with the review board. I asked to see the source inventory tags, but Mr. Greenfield produced only handwritten receipts with inconsistent dates and faded merchant stamps. Hale requested a follow-up investigation, which was denied for lack of probable cause. During that same month, a woman named Eloise Harwin, whose husband ran a spice stall, began compiling her own observations. In her letter to a local reverend, dated August 4th, she wrote, "I have passed the butcher's stall each morning for 3 years. Only recently have I seen him open before cockcrow, carrying buckets he tries to hide behind the carts." She enclosed a scrap of cloth she claimed came from his refuse. It bore what appeared to be a municipal workhouse insignia, stitched into the hem. Records from the workhouse on Orleans Avenue show that several indentured workers went missing during the summer of 1890. Most were presumed runaways. No formal connection was drawn to the market. Still, by late August, whispers had begun. A fisherman swore he saw Greenfield wheeling a heavy cart across the levee road at dusk, its wheels leaving deep, uneven ruts. A local vagrant, known only as Barker, told the night patrol he heard a woman sobbing behind the meat crates on more than one occasion. Patrolmen dismissed the claim, noting Barker's known inebriation, yet the market itself seemed to react. Patrons increasingly avoided stall 47, though no one would say why. Orders declined. Greenfield, however, did not reduce stock. If anything, his displays grew more elaborate. Intricate arrangements of sausages, hams stacked like architecture, cuts so uniform they resembled drawings in medical manuals. One observer, a German physician named Dr. Leopold Grunewald, wrote in a private notebook that the meat's texture showed no natural grain. The ligature points, if such they were, suggested human preparation. By the first week of September, the number of public sanitation complaints tied to stall 47 had tripled compared to the previous year, yet no legal action was taken. The French market, with its flow of untaxed goods and city patronage, was notoriously protected. Inspectors were discouraged from pursuing inquiries that could disrupt vendor relations or tourism. Still, Greenfield's calm demeanor began to slip. On the morning of September 10th, he was seen shouting at a delivery boy from the dockside poultry co, accusing him of tampering with his barrels. Witnesses described the outburst as violent, with Greenfield knocking over a pail of brine and snapping a broomstick in half. He later apologized and offered the boy a coin, but the moment was not forgotten. That same day, Detective Hale made an unannounced return to stall 47. He found the shutters half open and the butcher absent. In the rear lot beneath a tarpaulin, Hale discovered a shipment marked as salt pork, but sealed in heavy wax paper and lacking the customary certification stamp. He ordered the bundle sent for laboratory analysis. The results would not arrive for another 10 days, but by then the market would no longer be quiet. The laboratory results arrived at the central precinct on the morning of September 20th. Typed on thin paper and sealed in an envelope marked urgent, the report noted high levels of potassium nitrate and iron compounds, consistent with muscle tissue from a large mammal, but stopped short of identifying the meat as definitively porcine. The analyst, Dr. Edwin McClure, included a handwritten note at the bottom. Ligature marks observed on 2 samples, pattern irregular, suggest further inquiry. Detective Myron Hale read the file twice in silence. He then folded the report, slid it into his coat, and walked the half-mile to the French market, stopping only once to purchase a newspaper. When he arrived at stall 47, he found it empty. The stall gates were locked, the counter wiped clean, and the awning folded down as if the vendor were away for a day of rest. A chalkboard sign leaned against the door. Closed for Sabbath. It was a Friday. Hale circled the stall twice. Behind it, a narrow alley ran between the fishmonger's depot and a crumbling brick storage shed used by several merchants. A sour breeze drifted from an open window. He peered inside and saw only crates and ropes. Then he noticed the wet trail on the cobblestones, leading away from stall 47 and curving toward the levee, where the river swelled against the retaining wall. He followed the trail. The moisture had left a dull sheen on the stones, faint but continuous, like the path of a leaking bucket. It ended at a wooden trapdoor sunk into the ground behind the shed, chained and padlocked. Hale jotted a note, marked the location, and returned to the precinct to request a key from the municipal stores office. His request was denied. The door was on private property. That evening, as dusk settled over the quarter and the gas lamp sputtered to life, a woman named Miriam Calvet arrived at the police desk. Thin and dressed in mourning black, she held a folded parcel wrapped in newsprint. Her brother, she explained, had worked as a barrel porter for the market's waste hauler. He had disappeared 3 nights earlier, after his final shift ended at 9 p.m. The last address listed on his route was Greenfield stall. "I found this behind the stable," she said, placing the parcel on the counter. Inside was a pair of stained gloves, leather, thick, and cut for large hands. Stuffed inside one of them was a folded receipt marked 11 September, with Greenfield's signature and a payment entry. Scrawled in graphite beneath the line items were 2 words, "Not alone." Detective Hale reopened the file. Over the next 2 days, he canvassed the rear quarters of the market. Several porters remembered seeing the missing man, Auguste Calvet, wheeling his cart into Greenfield's back lot. None remembered him leaving. One vendor, an oyster seller named Rémy Lassalle, claimed to have seen Greenfield pacing alone by lantern light around midnight, mumbling numbers to himself. "He looked wet, like he'd been swimming," Lassalle said. "But he wasn't cold, just silent." On Sunday, Greenfield returned. He arrived before dawn, as he always had, his boots polished, his apron folded over one arm, the stall reopened with full stock, laid out in careful rows. He nodded to nearby vendors, greeted a constable, and resumed his usual rhythm. Yet something had changed. Odette Broussard, writing again in her journal, noted that he hummed now, softly and tunelessly, while sharpening his knives. "The sound grated the air," she wrote, "like iron scraping bone." She also observed that he wore a different apron than usual, thicker oilskin with a stiff fold at the chest that she claimed did not move naturally. The next day, Hale returned with a new warrant. It had taken considerable maneuvering. A friend within the mayor's office had intervened, citing multiple unexplained absences and structural violations. The warrant gave Hale access to stall 47, its adjoining storeroom, and all connected drainage points. Accompanied by 2 patrolmen and a clerk, Hale entered the stall just after noon. The inspection began normally. The cold boxes were emptied and found clean. The cutting tables, though heavily scored, bore no visible blood. But when Hale pried up a rear floorboard near the brining vats, a rush of foul-smelling vapor escaped. Beneath the floor was a hollow cavity, about 6 feet wide and lined with bricks blackened by age. Inside were 5 barrels, sealed with wax. The contents were removed and taken for examination. 3 contained preserved cuts of salted meat, unmarked and odorless. The 4th held what appeared to be a collection of bones, many splintered, some small enough to belong to children. The fifth barrel was only half full. Floating in a dark brine was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, inside of which lay a human femur, stripped clean except for a single gold ring still clinging to the knuckle. The ring bore the initials AC. Greenfield did not resist when Hale returned to arrest him. He merely asked for time to fold his apron and place it inside his satchel. His hands trembled slightly as he buttoned his coat. When asked if he had anything to say, he looked Hale in the eye and replied, "The meat is clean." The arrest shook the market. Vendors stopped mid-sale, stunned into silence. Patrons fled. City officials moved quickly to seal Stall 47 and release a public statement blaming rogue elements and vowing stricter oversight. But the damage had been done. Over the following week, rumors multiplied. Some claimed Greenfield had once worked for a traveling mortician. Others said he had bribed workhouse staff for access to unclaimed bodies. A ledger uncovered in his apartment showed irregular payments to at least 2 unknown recipients, both listed under false names. The basement beneath his residence on Royal Street was dry, unfurnished, and windowless. Yet the brick walls bore faint scratch marks, and a drain pipe near the rear wall had been recently replaced. When inspectors flushed the line, a rust-colored residue coated the catch basin. The press was kept at bay, but several local papers ran insinuating headlines. The Times-Democrat labeled it a market atrocity. The Picayune spoke of civic rot in the butcher's block, but few details were shared with the public. The mayor's office feared unrest, especially among immigrant workers, and issued a blanket denial of systemic failure. Hale's final report, submitted on October 5th, listed 12 points of concern, including falsified vendor licenses, non-existent suppliers, untraceable meat inventories, and numerous violations of storage protocol. But he stopped short of accusing any official of collusion. The language was clinical, detached. Privately, Hale wrote something different in his notebook. This was never one man's work. Too many looked away. Too many doors stayed closed. The barrels were sealed and stored in the municipal evidence vault. No formal identification was made of the bones. Greenfield was transferred to Orleans Parish Prison, where he awaited indictment. His cell was kept isolated. He did not speak. On the night of October 7th, guards found him standing in his cell, fully dressed, staring out a barred window. He had bitten clean through his tongue. Blood soaked his shirt. He survived but did not speak again. The market reopened within days. Stall 47 remained boarded up. On October 10th, 3 days after Ernest Greenfield was placed in solitary confinement, Dr. Lucius Benton arrived in New Orleans under commission from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Though officially sent to review sanitation protocols at the French market, Benton made no attempt to disguise his true assignment. He was tall, with a soft drawl and a waxed mustache, and introduced himself to city officials as a meat inspector first, but a man of conscience always. Benton's first act was to request access to the evidence barrels stored at the municipal vault. When the request reached the district attorney's office, it was approved in writing by Judge Enoch Salter, whose seal authorized access to all materials gathered from Stall 47. But when Benton arrived at the vault the next morning, only 3 of the 5 barrels remained. The registry clerk, visibly shaken, insisted the entry logs were intact. "No one signed them out," he said. "They're just not here." Detective Hale was summoned. He reviewed the log himself. The barrels had been registered on September 22nd, each tagged with a red ribbon indicating material pending analysis. No further entries appeared, no withdrawals. Yet barrels 4 and 5, the ones containing bones and the oilcloth bundle, were gone. Benton pressed for answers. The vault director, a former streetcar accountant named Corwin Latimer, claimed the room had been sealed for 3 weeks. When pressed, he admitted that janitorial crews occasionally accessed the floor for maintenance, but none had clearance to remove evidence. Hale made a note and returned to the precinct. By that evening, a second anomaly surfaced. The clerk in charge of prisoner intake at Orleans Parish Prison, a woman named Frances Llewellyn, reported that Greenfield's intake documents were missing from the logbook. The page for October 5th had been torn out. No copy existed. These omissions prompted the first internal inquiry. A joint session was held between city prosecutors, the police chief, and a representative from the archdiocese. The latter, Father Martin Joubert, had taken a personal interest after rumors began circulating that the bones recovered bore signs of sacrificial preparation. He demanded to view the autopsy files. None had been completed. The coroner's office had never received the remains. Outside, public curiosity was growing. A sketch of Greenfield's stall, published by a Boston journalist named Elias Woodham, circulated widely in pamphlets and private newsletters. Woodham had arrived in New Orleans with a press badge from the New England Examiner and a letter of introduction. His first article described the French market as a haven of stewed entrails and unchecked appetites, where blood drips between cobbles and no one asks the source. Woodham tried to interview vendors, but most refused. The few who did speak gave conflicting accounts. One fish seller claimed Greenfield spoke Spanish fluently and received shipments from the Gulf. A sausage maker swore he heard German spoken in the back room. None could confirm ever seeing him purchase livestock directly. As pressure mounted, city officials authorized a formal inspection of Greenfield's residence on Royal Street. A five-man team, including Benton and Hale, entered the property under full warrant on October 13th. The front parlor was spare but clean, its windows shuttered despite the afternoon light. A faint smell of vinegar clung to the stairwell. On the second floor, in a locked cabinet behind the study, they found 7 bound ledgers labeled in ink by year. The books were meticulously kept, filled with dates, weights, temperatures, and names of vendors, but something was off. Several names appeared more than once, attached to shipments weeks apart, yet their addresses were invalid. One vendor, Delacroix Provisioners, was listed 19 times. No such firm appeared in city records. Benton underlined each entry in red and initialed the margins. In the rear pantry, Hale noticed a cabinet drawer that sat unevenly in its frame. Behind it was a hollow compartment, no larger than a bread box. Inside were 4 photographs, sepia-toned and curling at the edges. Each depicted a butcher's block. On each block sat a different cut of meat. In one photo, a hand was visible in the background, partially blurred but unmistakably human. The photographs were confiscated. Within hours, they vanished from the evidence lockup. Only the red receipt remained. It had been pinned inside the photo sleeve, bearing the words, "For the week ending August 2nd, fully cured." Verified. Meanwhile, at Orleans Parish Prison, Greenfield remained silent. His wound had healed unevenly, and he was unable to speak clearly. A doctor had fashioned a wooden mouthpiece to aid in breathing, but the prisoner refused to use it. He communicated only by writing, though his notes were sparse. To every question posed by investigators, his answer was the same: prove it. On October 15th, a city janitor discovered something lodged behind a storm drain near the levee. It was a waxed canvas roll, heavily soaked and wrapped with twine. Inside were 14 brass identification tags, each bearing a stamped number. Most were corroded, but one remained legible. No. 317, traced to an inmate assigned to the municipal workhouse and listed as deceased from sunstroke 3 months earlier. No burial certificate had ever been filed. The find triggered another sweep of the market area. Workers uncovered more canvas fragments behind the storage shed near stall 47. Underneath them lay soil that had been disturbed repeatedly. Dogs brought in from the Port Authority began to dig. At a depth of 2 feet, they struck something hard. The object was flat, metallic, and stamped with the word disposal. Detective Hale ordered excavation. A shallow pit, no deeper than a rain barrel, revealed wooden boards and lime dust. No bodies were found. But in the soil were fragments of cloth, bootlaces, and a set of surgical scissors filed to a point. That night, Father Joubert returned to the precinct. He brought with him a copy of a 1878 diocesan report concerning the burial of paupers and convicts during the yellow fever outbreak. In a margin scribbled in Latin were the words, "Shall we render unto flesh what flesh has wasted?" He claimed the phrase was often whispered by penitents in the city's older parishes. Hale dismissed the quote as coincidence. But Benton, disturbed by the mounting irregularities, wrote directly to Washington. His letter described a coordinated effort to obscure, if not erase, the full scale of misconduct. He concluded, "I am the evidence does not vanish on its own. 3 days later, Benton's hotel room was burgled. His papers were strewn across the floor. Only one item was missing, a leather-bound journal he kept with sketches and notes from the Royal Street residence. There were no witnesses. In response, the city declared the investigation ongoing and placed all press inquiries under review. Hale was instructed to suspend field interviews. Benton was advised to return north for his safety. He refused. On October 20th, he filed a request for federal oversight. The next morning, his request was found shredded in the office waste bin. No copy survived. By the end of October, the French market was no longer a place of casual trade. Foot traffic thinned, and the air turned colder with each passing day. Shutters stayed closed longer. Stall owners exchanged fewer words. Most avoided looking at stall 47, though it remained sealed and quiet. The wood of its door now warped from the pressure of damp nights. Detective Hale, burdened by orders to stand down, continued his work in private. He no longer filed daily reports, but kept personal notes on onion-skin paper, folded tightly into his pocket. In these pages, he tracked inconsistencies, the missing vendor tags, the fluctuating workhouse census, and the curious fact that at least 3 known associates of Greenfield had either left the city or gone unaccounted for. One was the porter Auguste Calvet. Another was a farm supplier listed only by the initials DR, whose business had no location and whose last invoice bore no date. A breakthrough came unexpectedly. On November the 1st, a woman named Esther Wells arrived at the central station. Her voice was hoarse and her dress was torn near the hem. She carried a parcel wrapped in oilcloth and insisted on speaking only to Hale. She claimed to have worked as a scullery maid in a boarding house on Bienville Street, where Greenfield rented a room during the first weeks of July. Her story contradicted official records, which placed him in his Royal Street residence during that period. Wells described a series of deliveries made to the house at night, heavy parcels brought in by 2 men, always the same, always silent. She never saw Greenfield carry them, but she saw him waiting near the door wearing his butcher's apron. She said the kitchen drain often clogged after these visits, and the water in the courtyard reeked of tallow and iron. She presented the contents of the parcel as proof: a square of butcher's paper, stiff with dried fluid, bearing the printed seal of Delacroix Provisionnaires. Hale, recognizing the name from Greenfield's falsified ledgers, had the paper examined. Traces of arsenic were found in the fibers. Later that week, Hale returned alone to the boarding house. The owner, a Mr. Jarvis Mead, denied renting to Greenfield. But when Hale inspected the basement, he found recent repairs to the floorboards and several bricks stained dark with an oily substance. Mead produced no receipts for the work. At the same time, Benton had begun corresponding in secret with an archivist named Marilyn Sutter, who managed shipment ledgers at the port of New Orleans. Benton, careful not to implicate her, asked only for access to bills of lading filed during the months of July and August under the names used in Greenfield's ledger. Sutter found nothing official. But in the margins of a dock worker's logbook, she found repeated notations of unregistered crates, bulk meat, no mark, scheduled for offloading at night. She mailed Benton a copy of the page. He placed it inside a folded envelope, sealed it, and hid it behind a wall panel in his room at the Hotel Lafayette. 2 days later, the room across the hall caught fire. The source was listed as faulty lantern oil, though no lantern was found. Benton checked the panel. The envelope was gone. Word reached the archdiocese that Greenfield had once sought confession. Father Joubert, compelled by the mounting whispers, reviewed the penitent logs at St. Dominic's Cathedral. A single entry from May 1890 read, "Man in bloodied apron. Spoke of hunger not his own, refused absolution." Joubert requested an interview with Greenfield, which was granted under strict supervision. The meeting occurred on November 6th, in a chamber reserved for legal counsel. Greenfield was seated at the far end of the room, pale and thinner than before, his eyes red-rimmed and sunken. He stared at Joubert, but did not blink. The priest spoke gently, offering no accusations. He asked only what Greenfield feared. The prisoner responded by sliding a piece of folded paper across the table. On it, in cramped script, were the words, "You will find them beneath the bones." "They are not mine." Before Joubert could reply, the guards ended the session. Hale and Benton followed the lead. Using court clearance, they returned to the municipal vault to re-examine the remaining barrels. The bones from barrel 3 had been stored separately in a sealed crate. With careful force, they removed the bottom layer of skeletal fragments. Beneath them, wrapped in a sheet of muslin, were 3 metal objects. The first was a jaw clamp used in dental schools. The second was a tool resembling a rib spreader, but narrower with notches for rope. The third was a square iron tag, stamped with the initials EG and the number 29. The tag was traced to a shipment recorded in 1889 from a shuttered medical facility on the outskirts of Baton Rouge. The hospital, known as St. Halcyon's Infirmary, had been closed after a fire destroyed its west wing. Among its salvaged items were surgical tools, charts, and several unclaimed cadavers. No record indicated where the remains were sent. Benton requested an interview with the former administrator of St. Halcyon's, a retired surgeon named Dr. Thomas Pell. When contacted, Pell denied any knowledge of Greenfield but admitted that several tools had been sold off quietly to cover debts. He recalled one buyer, a tall man with narrow wrists and an accent, like he'd been raised in a courtroom. He remembered the man paying in exact coin, not bills. With pressure mounting, the district attorney's office held a closed-door meeting to determine whether charges could be formally filed. The disappearance of key evidence complicated the effort. Some board members argued that without bodies, there could be no prosecution for murder. Others claimed Greenfield's silence constituted deliberate obstruction. Outside, the public had begun to protest. Pamphlets were printed by a local abolitionist group calling for justice for the forgotten dead. A protest march reached the gates of the French market on November 10th. Vendors stood with arms crossed, refusing to speak. Someone had chalked the word butcher across the boarded stall. It was washed off before dawn. Inside the prison, Greenfield was moved to a different cell block. The official reason was risk of self-harm. Unofficially, it followed an incident in which a guard reported hearing tapping from beneath the cell floor. The pattern repeated nightly. 3 knocks, pause, then 2 more. The floor was checked. Nothing was found. That same week, a letter arrived at Hale's desk with no return address. The handwriting was ornate, the paper perfumed. It contained a single sentence. Some meats were never meant for commerce. Hale burned the letter, but made a note of the phrasing. The syntax matched a phrase Greenfield had used once, recorded during his initial interrogation. Commerce cloaks cruelty. Then, without warning, Greenfield fell ill. He collapsed during morning roll call, bleeding from the gums and sweating through his mattress. Prison doctors suspected poisoning but found no foreign substance. His temperature fluctuated wildly for 3 days. During the fever, he spoke fragments in sleep, naming rivers, dates, and something called the 8th cut. No one knew what it meant. When he recovered, his handwriting had changed, slanted, fractured, as if written by someone else. His next note read only, "Stop digging." But it was too late. The break came on the cold morning of November 17th, when a long-overlooked property record surfaced in the archives of the city's tax assessor. Filed under a false merchant name, the deed described a narrow brick structure tucked behind Chartres Street, just 2 blocks from the French market. Officially, it was listed as a smokehouse. No such structure appeared on the current maps. Detective Hale, along with Dr. Benton and a junior clerk, crossed the mist-covered market square at dawn. The structure was barely visible from the street, wedged between a cooper's shed and an overgrown alley. Its facade bore no markings. The hinges on the door were streaked green with oxidized brass, and a thin line of soot trailed upward from a vent above the eaves. The door was locked. Benton produced the warrant. A constable forced the latch with a bar. The stench was immediate. Warm, metallic and cloying, it rolled out in waves. The air inside was thick with smoke residue, and something else, something sweet and sour, like rotting syrup. The walls were blackened, the windows sealed with nailed planks. Light filtered through in pale shafts, illuminating dust and suspended particles that shimmered as they floated. The first room was empty, save for hooks bolted to the ceiling and a pile of worn canvas aprons folded near the hearth. The stone floor was greasy underfoot. In one corner, a narrow door led downward. Benton stepped first, lantern in hand. The stairs creaked but held. At the bottom, the walls narrowed and the temperature dropped. A layer of damp mildew coated the bricks. They reached a low chamber, roughly 10 feet across, where the lantern's glow revealed the remnants of a workbench, several metal trays, and 2 large wooden crates. The first was empty. The second was sealed with wax and rope. When Hale pried open the lid, the room fell silent. Inside were preserved sections of muscle tissue, carefully wrapped in linen and labeled in Greenfield's handwriting. The labels bore names, not cuts: Jonas, Marie, Child, July. Each piece was salted, arranged in order by weight. Tucked between 2 layers was a folded page from the Times-Democrat, its date aligning with the week of the meat's supposed curing. On a nearby shelf, they found a ledger unlike the others. Its cover was dark red, stamped not with initials, but with a hand-drawn symbol resembling a butcher's cleaver split down the center. Inside were anatomical sketches, dozens of them, depicting flayed limbs, vertebrae, and cross-sections of human organs. Each image was dated. Many were annotated with phrases like yield optimal or tendon compromised. Further in, the sketches became more detailed. One showed the dissection of a jaw, another the separation of knuckles with notes on cartilage density. The final pages bore lists of names, over 60, followed by weights, temperatures, and storage durations. Several names matched those found in earlier reports. Auguste Calvet was listed twice, his second entry underlined. Benton dropped his pencil. They continued deeper. Behind a false wall made of plaster and brick fragments, Hale discovered a narrow passage leading into what had once been a wine cellar. Now it had been converted. Hooks lined the ceiling beams. Chains dangled at uneven lengths. In the far corner, a drain had been cut into the stone. Beside it stood a rusted hand-cranked winch and a wooden table stained dark with old fluids. A single boot rested beneath the table. It matched the description given by Esther Wells of the garments worn by one of Greenfield's nighttime porters. Inside the boot was a note rolled tight and sealed with wax. Benton opened it with trembling fingers. The message read, "No one starves." Not here. The silence in the room was unbearable. Every creak from above echoed like thunder. Benton pressed a cloth to his mouth. Hale marked each item in his notebook, then stepped outside. The air hit like a slap. Within 2 hours, the building was under guard. A team of 6 was summoned for evidence retrieval. Yet by nightfall, 2 crucial artifacts, the anatomical ledger and the linen labels, had disappeared. The clerk who had accompanied Hale and Benton claimed to have last seen them on the second crate. No fingerprints were lifted, no explanation was given. That same night, Father Joubert was called to the prison. Greenfield had begun to speak again, but only in fragments. He refused to see Hale, Benton, or any other official. He requested the priest. The meeting took place at midnight in the infirmary, where Greenfield now lay restrained. His eyes were alert but unfocused. He did not greet Joubert, only whispered the phrase, "They knew, they let me." The priest asked who. Greenfield closed his eyes and repeated, "They let me." Pressed further, he said, "I kept the bones." They paid not to know. Joubert tried to elicit names, but Greenfield lapsed into a coughing fit. Blood welled from his mouth. A nurse rushed to intervene. The meeting ended. By morning, news of the cellar had leaked. Crowds formed near the market gate, many holding signs, others shouting names of the missing. Among them stood a man in a dark coat, holding a placard with the word Jonas. He refused interviews. He simply stared at stall 47. The press arrived in force. Woodham, the Boston journalist, published a 5-column exposé titled "The Meat Beneath," describing in detail the cellar's dimensions, the condition of the crates, and the contents of the table. Though he claimed to have seen the ledger himself, he offered no copy. His article concluded with a chilling line, "What cannot be sold is often fed to silence." Within days, city officials declared the smokehouse structurally unsafe and ordered it sealed. No further access was granted. The French Market Board denied all knowledge of the building's use and suspended operations at 3 adjacent stalls. A statement was issued blaming individual negligence. No mention was made of the missing ledger. No charges were expanded. Greenfield remained the sole suspect. On November 20th, Benton departed the city. He left no forwarding address. Hale, now working independently, spent his final weeks combing city death records. He noted a rise in unclaimed bodies during the months Greenfield's activity peaked. Many were listed as indigent or transients. Few had next of kin. Most were buried without ceremony or burned. A shipment manifest from the Potter's Field crematorium included 7 names found in Greenfield's red ledger. Their cremation dates predated their supposed entries in the curing logs. He underlined them in black ink. Then he closed the book. On the morning of November 22nd, as low fog pressed down over the French Quarter, a postal clerk named Aaron Decoux made a quiet delivery to the central precinct. Wrapped in butcher's paper and sealed with twine, the package bore no sender's name. The address was typed on a card, "To Detective M. Hale, Personal." Inside was a single item, a key. Iron, large-toothed, and affixed to a brittle tag labeled "Dry Storage East." There was no note, no return address, no further indication of its origin. Hale held it for several seconds before folding the paper around it and placing it in his coat. He walked the length of Chartres in silence, passing empty stalls and shuttered windows. The East Storage Building stood at the very edge of the market property, where the cobblestones gave way to gravel and the walls turned to bare brick. A rusted sign still hung from one hinge, "Authorized personnel only." The key fit. The door opened with a groan, and Hale stepped into the dark. The room was long, dry, and smelled of cured leather and dust. Shelves lined the walls stacked with crates, barrels, and folded canvas. A few broken tools littered the floor. At first glance it appeared unused, a forgotten storeroom. Then he noticed the narrow hatch set into the floor, partly concealed beneath a faded tarp. He knelt, pulling the tarp aside. The hatch had no lock, only a recessed iron ring. When he opened it, a sharp draft rose upward, carrying the faint smell of ash and ammonia. The lantern beam revealed a ladder descending into earth and stone. He climbed down without hesitation. The chamber below was colder than expected. Its walls were unfinished, packed dirt reinforced with timbers. A long corridor stretched ahead, lit faintly by oil lamps still burning low in their sconces. They had been lit recently. At the far end of the corridor stood a door. It was different from the others, made of iron set flush into the stone. Hale approached slowly, his footsteps muffled by the damp floor. He pressed his ear to the metal. Nothing. He turned the latch and pushed. The door opened inward with a weighted creak. Inside was a room no wider than a parlor, but tall and dry. The walls were lined with shallow drawers, hundreds of them, each labeled with a strip of parchment. Many bore names. Others had only numbers. Some had neither. At the center of the room was a table, and atop it a single bound book. Its spine cracked when Hale opened it. It was not a ledger, it was a log. Each page listed a date, a name, a weight, and a location. The earliest entries dated back to 1882. The final entry read, "Miriam, 64 lbs, market front." Hale's hands trembled. He flipped backward through the pages, scanning names. Dozens matched the reports he had compiled, the missing, the unclaimed, the nameless. Some had notes beside them. Resisted, damaged, delayed delivery. One page bore only 2 words. Clergy, no. He turned to leave. But just as he reached the threshold, a sound echoed down the corridor, soft, deliberate footsteps on the wooden rungs of the ladder above. He extinguished the lantern and stood still. The light from the sconces flickered as a figure descended, silhouetted in the narrow shaft. The man carried no lamp. He moved by memory. Hale remained still, breath shallow. The figure reached the chamber entrance, paused, then stepped into the room. He moved with care, placing one gloved hand on the central table. He did not look around. Instead, he reached into his coat and removed a bundle of cloth. He opened one of the shallow drawers and placed the bundle inside. Then slowly he turned toward Hale. It was not Greenfield. The man was older, broader in the chest, with a scar along his right cheek and a limp that dragged his left foot slightly. His eyes were calm. He said nothing. He simply nodded once, then turned back to the drawers and began arranging their contents. Hale backed away in silence, retreating into the corridor. He climbed the ladder as quietly as he could. The air above was still cold. The key turned easily in the lock. By the time he reached the precinct, his knuckles were white. That night he returned with 2 constables and an official warrant. The key was gone. The hatch was sealed. When they pried it open, the ladder led only to dry earth. The chamber was no longer there. A report was filed. It was marked inconclusive. 2 days later, the clerk who had delivered the original package to Hale was found dead in the levee drainage canal. His body bore no injuries. The coroner listed the cause as drowning. On November 25th, Greenfield entered a catatonic state. He stopped eating, speaking, and responding. His eyes remained open but fixed. The prison physician noted no neurological cause. He remained this way for 4 days. On the 5th, he began to whisper again. The same word over and over, 70. When asked to explain, he scratched a number into the wall with a fingernail. 70. A review of his last recorded ledger revealed 69 confirmed names. No one knew who the 70th might be. Then a letter arrived at the office of Father Joubert. It was unsigned, written in tight cursive, and sealed with wax. The message read, "The last has been fed. No others remain." It included a list of ingredients and instructions for salting flesh. At the bottom was a quote attributed to the Old Testament, though no such verse could be found. "He who sells flesh shall own none of his own." Joubert collapsed upon reading it. He was placed on medical leave. With public attention mounting, the city prepared for trial. Yet no new evidence could be introduced. The ledgers were gone. The cellar was sealed. The supposed chamber under East storage had been filled with rubble. Photographs had vanished from file cabinets. Witnesses retracted statements. Vendors who had spoken earlier now denied knowing Greenfield at all. Benton, unreachable for weeks, sent a single telegram to Hale. It read, "They erased the ledger. But the hunger is recorded in the market itself. Burn it." The market did not burn, it remained open. The stall was never leased again. The trial of Ernest Greenfield began on January 6, 1891, in a courtroom heavy with damp air, and watched by a city already split between fear and disbelief. The indictment listed 12 counts of murder, 5 of unlawful disposal, and 1 of public endangerment. Yet without the preserved remains, without the ledger, and with every physical link steadily vanishing from municipal custody, the prosecution struggled to ground its case. Greenfield was wheeled into court thinner than ever, his lips cracked, eyes dull. He did not speak. He wore a plain coat and gloves provided by the jail, and when asked to confirm his identity, he only blinked twice. The courtroom fell silent. Witnesses were few. The laundress, Odette Broussard, had moved north and declined to return. The clerk who first filed the odor complaints had left the city. Only Esther Wells testified, her voice shaking as she described the apron, the weight of the deliveries, the kitchen water running red. But under cross-examination, she admitted she never saw inside the crates. The defense emphasized this point until her statement cracked. Hale was called to the stand on the 4th day. He delivered a precise, careful summary of the investigation, the crates, the cellar, the tools, the names. He was not permitted to mention the vanished evidence. When asked directly whether he could confirm the identity of the preserved remains, he hesitated. "No, not by legal standard," he said. The courtroom murmured. Dr. Lucius Benton did not appear. A telegram received the morning of his scheduled testimony reported that his residence in Philadelphia had burned overnight. He was presumed dead. No remains were recovered. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On January 13th, they returned a split verdict. On charges of public endangerment and concealment, Greenfield was found guilty. On all charges of murder, the verdict was not proven. The sentence was life imprisonment, with no parole. He was returned to Orleans Parish Prison, where his cell was reinforced and his name removed from public registries. Outside the courthouse, a crowd waited. They had no signs, no chants, only faces pinched with something heavier than outrage. A woman in mourning black dropped a small parcel at the prison gates. It was never claimed. Inside were 6 nails and a folded piece of meat wrapping paper smeared faintly with ash. After the verdict, the market board issued a series of denials. The stalls were inspected, the sanitation offices restructured, and new forms of vendor registration were introduced. A small committee reviewed Greenfield's trade permits and declared them fraudulently obtained but lacking collusion. No officials were removed. No charges were filed. The smokehouse on Chartres was demolished in late February. Local records marked the lot as cleared for sanitation. When demolition workers broke the stone foundation, they unearthed a rusted pipe and a small iron tag, scorched and unreadable. One worker, interviewed anonymously, claimed they found something else, a row of ribs perfectly cleaned laid beneath a sheet of lime. He did not sign a formal statement. In the months that followed, other stories emerged. A dock worker confessed in a tavern that he once transported salted cuts to a boarding house, under orders not to ask questions. A retired sanitation inspector mentioned, in a letter to a friend, that he had signed off on a closed drain job near stall 47, paid in coin under the table. A former cellmate of Greenfield claimed the man talked in sleep about flesh cycles and the threshold of hunger. None of these statements reached court. The press, after initial fervor, went quiet. Editors were warned of libel. Printers were advised to redirect their attention towards civic restoration. Only Woodham, the journalist from Boston, continued to write. In April, he published one last piece, a letter titled Beneath the Cobblestones, mailed to subscribers privately. In it, he claimed that city records showed a decline in indigent burials during the years Greenfield operated. He provided no figures, only a closing line. The appetite was systematic. Woodham vanished 2 weeks later, last seen boarding a ferry across the Mississippi. The French market remained open. Tourists returned by summer. Vendors resumed full operations. The stalls were freshly painted. Blood was washed from the drainage lines. Patrons avoided stall 47, even though it now sold only spices. The vendor, a silent man with clean fingernails, never made eye contact. In December of that year, a plaque was installed on the outer gate of the market, listing dates of public improvements and recognizing vendors lost to illness or accident. Greenfield's name did not appear. Neither did Calvet's. Neither did Jonas. Hale left the force the following spring. He relocated to Mobile, where he opened a bookstore and rarely spoke of New Orleans. In his final filed memo, sent to the district archives before his resignation, he included a single paragraph. I do not believe Greenfield acted alone. I do not believe he operated unseen. I believe he served a system that required him. No reply was issued. Years passed. In 1895, a contractor digging new foundation lines beneath the market square uncovered a cavity lined with bricks. Inside were fragments of linen, rotted ropes, and the remains of 7 drawers, each stamped with numbers and burned along the edges. The police arrived. The area was resealed. The find was never mentioned in city bulletins. But for weeks afterward, the alley behind the former stall 47 filled with flies, and on certain nights near closing, the butcher's hooks above the spice stall still swayed, even when there was no wind. In the early months of 1896, 2 years after Greenfield's arrest, an inquiry was quietly opened by the Department of Agriculture into record inconsistencies from the New Orleans vendor registry between 1887 and 1890. Headed by a clerk named Raymond Cutter, the audit found that at least 16 vendor applications contained forged stamps from farms that no longer existed. Most were signed by the same hand. Among these were 3 names that had appeared in the now-vanished Red Ledger. Cutter's findings never reached public record. His summary report was marked internal review only. In a letter to his wife, later recovered among his estate, he wrote, "The city is not asking what it was fed, only how to resume feeding." By then, the prison where Greenfield was held had already changed administrators. His cell, originally isolated in the northwest wing, had been moved after a roof collapse exposed the foundation to the rain. The relocation report listed structural failure, but no repairs were made. Guards assigned to the new wing noted that the prisoner had stopped writing altogether. He now spent most days staring at the wall, tapping slowly against the floorboards with his heel in sequences no one could interpret. In March of that year, a new chaplain was appointed to the prison, a Methodist named Reverend Clark who had never met Greenfield before. On his first visit to the cell, Clark brought a worn copy of Psalms and tried to engage the prisoner in prayer. Greenfield said nothing. Instead, he reached for the book, turned to the center, and tore a single page. He folded it neatly and handed it back. On the paper, written in a fine, careful hand, were the words, "There were others before me. I was chosen because I kept the records clean." The chaplain filed a report. It was never added to the case file. Elsewhere, the names linked to the vanished began to disappear from conversation. The laundress was presumed dead after a storm destroyed the boarding house where she lived. Her journal, once circulated quietly among local women, was lost. The workhouse listed a fire in its archives room. Burial records for the pauper cemetery were deemed irrecoverable due to mildew. A cabinet of vendor receipts at City Hall went missing during renovations. No formal monument was ever built. No victim list was compiled. Instead, the event narrowed into a single name, a single narrative, one that could be contained and shelved. Greenfield became a myth spoken of in half-sentences, turned into warnings passed to apprentices, and whispered over late-night drinks. The market did not close. In 1897, an advertisement appeared in a regional trade paper. "Experienced butcher seeks stall lease near port. Familiar with salting cold storage, discretion." The contact name was an alias, but the handwriting matched a letter from the smokehouse ledger. By the time anyone noticed, the listing was gone. Visitors to New Orleans in the following years often remarked on the market's odd design. Its narrow walkways, its peculiar drainage patterns, the tight construction of its eastern storage wing. One architect from St. Louis sketched a cross-section in his notebook and added a margin note. Structure suggests modification over time, purpose unclear. Drainage beneath east stalls unusually deep. A decade later, in 1905, that section of the market flooded during a spring storm. Workers clearing the debris found several long iron hooks buried under layers of soil and brick. They were collected, cleaned, and sold as scrap. One bore a carved initial, barely legible beneath the rust, J. No one in the salvage yard questioned where the hooks came from. They were tools, that was all. As the century turned, city officials sought to rebrand the district, painting the market's legacy in brighter tones. Photographs were commissioned, stalls renamed, plaques mounted. Greenfield's name vanished from all records. His cell was later converted into a storeroom for linens. His trial was cited in law books only as a procedural footnote, but there were those who remembered. In 1912, an elderly vendor named Emile caught pneumonia and died in the rear lot behind the oyster stall. In his pocket was a folded page from a vendor application dated 1889. On the reverse, written in trembling pencil, was a final confession. "We knew it wasn't pork, we sold it anyway. No one ever returned a complaint." The document was filed, then misplaced. And beneath the city, the old tunnels remained, sealed now, forgotten, crushed under concrete and time. No records list them anymore. But sometimes, during renovations, workers uncover bricks that shouldn't be there. And always they're told to fill it and move on, because memory, when inconvenient, can be buried just as deeply as bone. And in a city built on layers of hunger, trade, and silence, some histories were never meant to stay above ground.